Well, good morning and welcome to the Nonprofit Navigation Series on measurement, evaluation, and fundraising success for social impact. My name is Tom Vansaghi, and I'll be your facilitator this morning of the content. I'd like to thank Tim Sweeney and Cindy, Mark, everybody at the Midwest Center for all their help in pulling this together this morning. If you're not on mute, please mute yourself just in case you have any background noise. So what I plan to do is present material, and then we'll take questions and answers at the end. However, Cindy is monitoring the chat, and if there's a question relating to something I'm talking about, we'll pause at any point to take that question. But definitely want to have a discussion about this towards the end. So this is actually a seminar that the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership has done in the summer. We had to cancel it this past summer, so I know at least one of you that's on this morning was going to participate in that class. But so what I've tried to do is try to highlight some of the most important things from really what's important about measurement and evaluation related to fundraising. Again, my name is Tom Vansaghi. My job is that I'm assistant professor of nonprofit leadership at William Jewell College in Liberty, but I've had the privilege of serving as a senior fellow at the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership at UMKC for probably almost a decade now, and it's been absolutely one of the most important things that I do and the highlights of my life. So I love doing this, and it's a pleasure to have been asked to do that, to do this morning. So just like a good teacher, I like to have learning outcomes to give you a sense of what hopefully some of the highlights are that you'll hear about this morning. So first, we'll talk about highlights about social impact evaluation. So we're just going to really run through some key core information. Secondly, just we'll really drill into theories of change, logic models, dashboards, and how they're specifically important and useful with regard to fundraising. And then finally, you'll have a chance to ask questions or really share other information relative to the information that we'll be discussing today. So in a lot of my PowerPoint presentations, I also like to highlight artwork from various artists. And today I'm highlighting the artwork of David Alfaro Siqueiros, a Mexican muralist artist. So a lot of the art is, all of the art in this presentation is from Siqueiros, and and what he did really in the early part of the 20th century. And I should thank David Oliver. If you don't know David Oliver, friend him on Facebook, because he's always posting art. And this was, I don't think I'd ever would have heard of this artist if it hadn't been for David. So I don't know if he's on this morning, but a shout out. So I want to credit a lot of some of the material this morning that's in the slide presentation is thanks to Dr. David Renz and Dr. Scott Helm from a presentation they gave to the Social Entrepreneurship Certificate Program at the U.S. Association for Small Business. So we want to credit some of the sources. So first of all, a question would be, why should nonprofits evaluate? Why should nonprofits even conduct evaluations? Well, to satisfy a funder, wrong. That's really, I think, the first myth that I want to kind of bust, because just doing evaluation to get a grant or to satisfy a funder's wishes is really the wrong reason to do it. Definitely not to win a grant, but to improve a program's efficiency, effectiveness, and impact is absolutely why you want to do evaluation. But ultimately, really, it's about ensuring that the mission, or what I call the why, is being carried out by your organization. You should really look at evaluation and measuring your programs and effectiveness, ultimately because you want to make sure that the reason why you're created, like the reason why your nonprofit was created, is fully being realized and carried out. So there's different kinds and ways of thinking about evaluation. There's performance evaluation, ensuring that your programs are high quality, that they're effective, that they're efficient. You can look at monitoring, just process evaluation, just as you go through programming, making sure that you're reaching the right audience, the right participants, and that it's being implemented implemented well. And then just general program evaluation, looking at the outcomes based on what you're hoping to accomplish. And so throughout the presentation, we'll just kind of to level set, outcomes and outputs are really important terms. Outcomes ultimately are what funders and what we as nonprofits ought to be focused on. The outcomes are really the reason why the program exists, that supports the mission of the organization. So in other words, why are our lives impacted? How are lives impacted? How is change happening, and is change happening? So versus outputs would be more like counting the number of people participating in a program, or the number of programs that you're putting on or putting together. And so outcomes are really the most important and where you should be focusing. So one of the key questions about this whole topic is, how much evaluation is too much? And this is something that if you're focused directly on fundraising, especially, this is a question you should ask yourself before running out and applying for a grant or for funding. Or really, frankly, if you're on a board, if you're an executive director, really at any level, really questioning the amount of evaluation that's required versus the amount of money that's coming from the funder, especially. So there's not really a simple answer for every nonprofit. Again, I think it depends on your capacity. It depends on your staffing levels. Ultimately, being able to do quarterly reporting and a lot of measurement and data analysis, that's going to take some time. Fortunately, some funders, like federal funders, allow you to build in measurement and evaluation into your into the amount that you're requesting from a funder. Many foundations do not do that. But I think what you should do, again, is just to make sure that you understand exactly what is being asked. If you are to receive the funding, you understand what it is. And then, is this evaluation doable? Can you carry this out? Do you have the staff time? Does it fit your mission? How complex is the evaluation? How experienced are you in tracking these this kind of data and information, and doing it right? Because the last thing you want to do is win a grant, everybody's excited, and then you get into it and realize, holy cow, this is a lot of work. We aren't staffed for this, and ultimately realize that that it really wasn't worth it for you, and then you end up not being able to meet those deadlines. You're not able to do the evaluation that's required, and then obviously you've burned a bridge with a funder. And so that's the last thing you want to do, is put your trust on the line. So when we think about, what is it that we're trying to measure? When we think about outcomes, how are we really phrasing that? And I think another way to phrase that would be social impact. What is social impact? So to define it, this is one of my favorite quotes, that at its basic level, social impact is where our deepest gladness meets the world's deepest need. And that's a quote from Frederick Buechner. And it's the intersection between, what your nonprofit can do and what the need is in the world. And so I think if we're working in that space, that's the sweet spot where we're really working in our purpose space, our why space, and it's true to our mission. Otherwise, I think it's something we should really rethink and reconsider. So formally, process of evaluation is really just a systematic way to ensure that you are taking a look at the work that you're doing and its impacts, and learning about its effectiveness. So ultimately, the whole thing is that it's like and we'll talk about this. This is basically a circle. So you can get information about the programs that you do, so that you can improve the programs going forward. And that's really ultimately, when we think about what a funder is really after when it comes to evaluation, they want to make sure that you're paying attention to the work that you're doing and ensuring that it's good work and that it's meeting its need. And then if it's not, that you can make tweaks and improvements as you go. So again, it's really something that you should give a lot of thought to at the outset. If you're here as a fundraiser, as a grant writer, as somebody whose primary job is to win funding or seek funding for a nonprofit organization, then it's really critical that there's alignment between your mission, your purpose, and the funder's purpose. So that's important. But when you're building a proposal or working um, receive funding, then what's important is for you to really think through the program itself. It's important to sit down, if your agency is large enough, sit down with your program staff, the people who are actually on the ground delivering programs, and talk through with them how the program works, what's involved in it, what are identify these key outcomes, these key things that are going to be important, and then talk through how you're going to learn and measure those impacts. And so that's important to do at the beginning, not to wait until you're already funded or you have a grant that you have to report on. And so getting involvement from funders is important, and also policymakers and staff in terms of how you're going to do that. And so the theory of change and logic models are a way for you to kind of map this out and really think through what the key components are in this whole process of program design and evaluation. So you want to know, okay, when you think about evaluation design, what is it that you want to know when you're talking about delivering a certain program? Exactly what part of the program will be intersecting with clients, with the people that you're serving, and then what is it that you want to know? How is it that where is it that the changes are happening? Where is it that people are going to hopefully grow as a result of your work? And then how can you measure it? And again, thinking about data can tell you a lot about the impact, how people are growing on a scale of 1 to 10. How did this program impact your ability to to learn new skills, to eventually to get a job? I saw Eileen Babowski, her face popped up. Hi, Eileen. And I know a little bit about the work that she's doing in terms of doing a lot of workforce development, workforce training for refugees and people who are underserved. And so ultimately, I think what her work is about is ultimately how do you help people gain new skills so then they can become employed at the end of the day. So really identifying what are those metrics, how will you measure it, who's going to tell you about that, and then how are you going to examine the data? Once you get the data, whether it's through a survey or through other means, focus groups, you're going to need to talk about how you will analyze that so you can ultimately say, yes, we're hitting our mark, or no, we are not. So there's two core orientations around evaluation. One is called formative, and the other is called summative or summative. And so formative is really evaluation that's happening in the middle. So it's when you're in the process of you're in the process of implementing a program, you can report out how it's going. And so thinking about while you're in the midst of something, how will you know you're on track? So that way, if you needed to make small course corrections, you could. So that way you ultimately are getting where you want to be. And so not just waiting until the program is completely done. People have gone through your program, and then at the end saying, okay, how'd we do? It's a matter of really getting feedback from them throughout the process. Whereas summative feedback is at the end. It's an evaluation that would allow you to learn about, did this program ultimately make a difference? Did it have an impact on them? And summative can also be long-term. I think a lot of us are in the work of hoping to change lives, and reset lives over a long period. And I think a question about how do I know in 5 years whether people who went through our program, whether they are still in a good place, are they still healthy, are they still making good choices? And that gets very difficult. It's time consuming to follow up, to find and identify those individuals, especially in, if you're talking about homeless people. I mean, these are people who you're going to have to track down. They hopefully are, they have a place to live and a permanent address, but being able to track them and follow them over a long period of time may be really challenging. And so being able to do that is going to be really important, but also something to think through. So in almost every fundraising course and opportunity that I have to talk about this work, I always bring this back to the what I call the big why. It's, why do you exist? Why were you founded? What is it that you're hoping to do? What change are you hoping to make in the world? And to be sure that your work is grounded in this, that you as a staff person, as an executive director, as a board member, can clearly and can clearly articulate your why, your reason for being. So especially as a staff person, you have to be able to answer that question: why do you exist? And you should answer that in a compelling, concise way that allows people to really say, wow, yeah, I didn't, I've never thought about that, or that is a need in society, and I'm so glad that you are working to address that. And I won't play this TED Talk. I just want to throw it out there. Again, if you've had a class with me or been involved in any of the work I've done, I would love Simon Sinek, his whole famous TED Talk, which is really old, but it's still a great message about start with why. And if you haven't seen it, it's 18, 19 minutes long. But the essence of what he says, the purpose, the real message of start with why, is what he calls his golden circle. And he talks about, too often in any business, this is not a fundraising or nonprofit TED Talk at all, by the way, and he has books and lots of other trainings and things, and it's not at all geared towards nonprofit work or fundraising at all specifically, but he talks about how most people spend all their time talking about what we do, or maybe how we do it, but we hardly ever talk about why. And that he really believes, and I believe, that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And he says the goal is to do business with people who believe what you believe. The goal is to do business with people who believe what you believe. And so that's a really important message and realization about fundraising, because if you're working with an individual, with a foundation, with a corporation, they're most likely going to be very interested in furthering your mission, your purpose. So understanding what their interests are and how your interests and their interests intersect is absolutely the core of fundraising. And that's why it all starts with why. So how does this why stuff, how does purpose intersect with measurement? Well, it's everything. It's everything. It's about about how you are advancing your mission, your why, your vision, your values. So just basically the mission is what is it that you were founded to do? Why do you exist? The vision is kind of talking about the long-term state that you hope to accomplish through the services, through the work that you do. And then finally, your vision is really your guiding principles or your core beliefs. And so the why statement can really kind of embody all of this, probably mostly aligned with your mission statement, but the why is maybe even more succinct, more powerful, and more compelling than even your mission, because missions are supposed to be really short. So this is sort of a graphic to put a lot of these ideas together. And so obviously, starting with the nonprofit, what is your core purpose? What is your why? What are you ultimately trying to accomplish? Then understanding, what specifically are you doing? How do you know you're working on a problem, a social problem, or you're working in a space with that clients, they need something, there's a gap in the world. So really understanding that, then developing programming that aligns with the needs of your clients and the reason why you exist, and then implementing the program, and then beginning that what I referred to earlier as formative evaluation, where you're measuring a program as you're implementing it. And then finally, the summative evaluation at the end of the program that will inform, are we succeeding at our why? Are we achieving the mission and the work that we set out to do? And then, that would feed back into, does this continue to meet our clients' needs? And then building the program or implementing the program. And so it's just this continuous cycle. And it's a cycle of improvement, if you're familiar with quality work from the 1980s, 1990s. So I'm just going to very quickly run through a theory of change, what that means. Many of you are probably very fluent in building a theory of change, what that means. Logic models, we're going to talk about those as well. Theory of change and logic models are very similar. And then my favorite, which are our dashboards, and that's where we'll conclude this morning. So a theory of change is really a statement or a way of describing how your agency, how your nonprofit will eventually, hopefully, reach its desired social impact. It's called a theory because you're hoping to put forward evidence that will demonstrate that you are reaching your ultimate goal, and it's through research, experience, and other evidence that links the work that you do with the ultimate social impact that you're hoping to make. So the components of a theory of change are, and these are very similar to a logic model, are inputs. So it's the staff, it's your expertise, it's the equipment, it's really the stuff that goes into making a successful nonprofit run. Then the processes, the activities, the programs, the actual work that you're doing that makes this whole thing come together. And then we get into the results or the outcomes. And the theory of change assumes that if you have the necessary inputs and resources, you will be able to use them to conduct certain processes, and then the desired change or social impact will occur. And so it's a very straightforward, very basic. It's mapping out, what expertise, what resources you have or you need, the process that you'll follow, and then the results that will be achieved as a result of your work and of your efforts. So a friend of mine, I call him a friend because he's just a wonderful man. His name's Matthew Carr. If you haven't met Matthew, he's the director of evaluation at the Kauffman Foundation. And he's always, when I've taught this seminar, I always invite Matthew in because I think it's critical for nonprofits to hear from funders. What is it that they are hoping to achieve in evaluation and in program design? And so Matthew is just just absolutely a zealot around ensuring that nonprofits aren't building evaluation and doing evaluation and measurement just to make a funder happy. He's really, really adamant that nonprofits do this work of measurement and program evaluation because it's the right thing to do, because we really want to ensure that our programs are the best that they can be and that we're ultimately serving our missions and our ultimate why. But he talks about the vegetables before the dessert. And so he talks about developing a theory of change or a logic model before you jump into collecting data and analyzing the data. And so this is a slide that he's used multiple times in my class. And so love that he's done that. And so this is just a simple sample of what a theory of change would look like. Again, identifying a social problem. What is it that you're hoping to change? And then this also mirrors what you might think of as strategic planning or planning work. And so what are the strategies that you are hoping to follow? And then the goals under those strategies that will ultimately lead to an impact. And so we don't have time to go through this in detail. I have another slide here that kind of fills this in. It's basically an after-school program in Kansas City that hopefully will ultimately have initiatives like after-school tutoring, summer literacy programs, book distribution. Students will be participating in reading programs, and students will enter the next school year with stronger reading proficiency. So these are the goals of the specific initiatives and strategies, and ultimately the impact. Students in Kansas City are able to achieve success in school and life, leading to a greater prosperity and a higher quality of life. And so mapping this out, being really clear as you are either building out a program or working on funding a program or ensuring that your agency is totally aligned with the problem that you're hoping to address, the initiatives and strategies, the specific goals and how those are working towards or supporting the initiatives and strategies, but ultimately going back to the word outcomes, what is that outcome that you're really hoping to achieve? So then moving into logic models. Again, this is something that if you're a grant writer, you're very familiar with these. These have been around for a few years, but again, it's a great way to think about the ways in which your programs and your evaluation models should align. So again, very similar to theory of change, we have inputs. Those are the things that support the agency, and we'll talk specifically about those in a minute, but staff, resources, other sorts of expertise, activities, the things that you will do. Outputs, what are the basic outputs, like how many people you're hoping to serve, how many programs are you planning to deliver, how many books are you going to place into clinics in the community, those kinds of things. And then the outcomes, what are you hoping to change? How does the desired outcome help solve the social problem that you're ultimately trying to work toward? And then more complicated or sophisticated logic models might have long-term outcomes, as well as more broader community impact. So you could have a simple logic model with just inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. More sophisticated, you can talk about long-term outcomes, and even more generally, how does the work you do create a healthier and better community, nation, world? So this is what a logic model looks like, laying it out with the inputs, the resources, the activities, what exactly you're doing, who are the people that you're working with, when you're planning to do it, and then the outputs. These are the activities that will be produced, the number of persons trained, plans developed, equipment, technology upgrades accomplished, etc. And then the outcomes. I've talked a lot about this already, but what is the ultimate goal of your program? What is it ultimately that you're hoping to do? And your outcomes would go back to the why statement. They would directly correlate with supporting your why. So there's a lot of reasons to do this. I mean, obviously, just putting together a logic model or a theory of change can be very useful for your internal stakeholders, decision makers, like your staff, your executive management team, program staff, really help them and remind them of how all of this fits together. And then also for board members. Board members need to be reminded and continually, ensured that, it's their job. It's one of their fiduciary responsibilities to keep a nonprofit focused on the mission, focused on the why. And so these are ways to do that. But then you can also use these tools for external stakeholders like funders, like we've been talking about, even though the reason why you do evaluation is not to satisfy a funder, but funders love this stuff. So obviously it's a secondary audience. And then talking to civic leaders, policymakers, as we all know and believe, I mean, we have a role to play in changing social policy and making macro change and macro impact within our scope of expertise as nonprofits. And then just in general, the community, how do you explain how your programs are actually connected to your mission and how they're making that social change? And then this is a little bit more of a complex logic model that really kind of talks about the situation, the social problem, the priorities that you might have, and then we get into the inputs, the outputs, and then you can see the long-term, the short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes that you might hope to achieve, and then you even have like how the evaluation then intersects with the logic model itself. So it can be very simple or more complex. So my favorite are dashboards. I'm a huge proponent of dashboards in any strategic planning work that I'm involved in. And this is a way for, especially for higher level staff, leaders of an organization, and board members to just keep an eye on the essential work that's being done to ensure that we're meeting targets, that you're on track, and ultimately meeting the mission or the why of the organization. And so this is critical for monitoring a strategic plan, a development plan, and ensuring that it's being addressed. It's not just sitting on a shelf. And it can very simply signal to board and staff that you're measuring, you're keeping track of things, and that you're just not hoping, in a year or 3 years that we've hit our targets. So it's very similar to budgeting, kind of keeping an eye on this. This is something that's continually going to need maintenance. I'm in charge of strategic planning at William Jewell College, and we have a very, we take our dashboard very seriously. We're only updating it on an annual basis, but it essentially is something that our board and our key leaders at the college are watching and ultimately hoping to reach milestone goals as we work on a 5-year strategic plan. But the idea of a dashboard, very simply, comes from the idea of an airplane dashboard or a car dashboard, where you have a lot of dials and indicator lights that are going to come on and hopefully tell you, oh, my oil is low, or I need to take a look at my tires or check engine, just depending on the kinds of things that you are monitoring on your car would be exactly the kind of thing. What are the highest strategies, the strategic initiatives that you're keeping track of? And are you on track? Are you on target? And if not, how do you make those corrections? It's very similar to measurement and evaluation. So in terms of creating a dashboard, it's important to start with key performance indicators. These are really, how do you take your most important goals or objectives that you want to track and put them into a framework of, these are how we want to see this goal ultimately achieved. In other words, a key performance indicator would tell somebody looking at your dashboard or your planning information, measurement and evaluation information about hopefully what it is that you're looking to do. So a dashboard should, the other really important thing about a dashboard is that, as I mentioned, like indicator lights coming on in a car, a very simple way of ultimately coding your dashboard and changing and updating your dashboard would be to have color codes on each of your initiatives. For green, meaning you're in good shape, you're meeting your targets; yellow being caution, we need to watch this area; or red, we're nowhere near meeting our goals and we need to really rethink whether this goal makes sense, or how do we change the work that we're doing to get closer to where we would like to be. So the dashboard, like I mentioned at Jewell, we're always looking at it, we're tweaking it, but ultimately for us, a lot of the data that we're looking at only comes out on an annual basis. If you can update it more regularly than that, I would certainly recommend it. Maybe even making it an updated dashboard that you present at every board meeting, assuming your board's meeting about quarterly. Probably monthly is a little too much, but definitely keeping this out there for your board to continue to revisit. So there are lots of resources for doing it. This, well, this is just more about key performance indicators.
Can I?
Yeah. Yes.
I've got a question here, maybe since you've been talking about evaluation and then tying it in with this. So can you just clarify, the KPI, the key performance indicator, is that an output or an outcome? And how would you, clarify that?
Yeah. So I think I was going to drill a little bit more into key performance indicators here. These are really probably much closer to outcomes, as opposed to outputs. I mean, they're really kind of getting into the real details and kind of the essence of what it is that you're working on, but you still have to make it measurable. You have to think about how do we know we're going to see an impact? How are we going to be able to measure that? And so that can be something that you have to give some thought to around surveying or focus groups or interviews with clients or people that you serve to ensure that you're hitting certain key performance indicators. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about them. You can look at them as being representing, what might be considered business model drivers, reflecting progress toward outcomes, and they're actionable. So they can get very sort of at the level of even though it's very outcome based and focused on how change is made over time, it's also actionable and it's measurable. And these are things that will change over time. These aren't set in stone. About, for example, it's not something that you're going to have an outcome, like your mission statement. You might only reflect on that every 5 to 10 years. Your key performance indicators would maybe only change every 2 to 3 years, probably looking at your strategic plan, and you would adopt key performance indicators for each of your key, your strategic initiatives, or even going deeper into key performance indicators for goals. And so key performance indicators, you could have key performance indicators, again, kind of the mirror and match your all of the areas of the nonprofit that you're hoping to keep track of, not just programmatic, but financial health. Are we hitting key performance indicator targets for financial health? These would definitely be more outcome focused for financial health, because that's, financial data is going to be very outcome based. Are we hitting budget targets? Do we have a reserve? I know a lot of nonprofits, especially right now, we're thinking about how do you manage through a crisis, or when you're in a situation where you have to look at, we've had a downturn in the economy, we've had a pandemic, everything's closed down. So, we need to use our reserve fund in order to help keep the lights on. So that might be a good KPI or a good target. Fundraising and development could have its own set of performance goals in terms of how we're hitting targets around fundraising. Then, of course, getting into program service delivery, these would be probably much more focused on outcomes, ways in which you're seeing people's lives change and but you can have them in all areas of the nonprofit. And these are ways that you can keep all areas of your nonprofit on some measurable performance tracking and evaluation. And again, it can be a way for you as an executive director or a leader in the nonprofit to be able to just know that we're all rowing, we're all moving the needle towards our ultimate goal, our why. And then, of course, for the board to see this is also critical and important.
Hey, Tom.
Yes.
Your buddy, Julie Assel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, was asking kind of what you just said, but she was kind of wondering what the role of output, sort of along the way, are outputs measured also, kind of to keep you with what you just said about how do you know you're moving along? How do you sort of track that along the, moving towards something?
Right. Yeah. And hey, Julie. So we've got some people on this call that are way more experts than I am in this area. But yeah, sure. I think that thinking about keeping track of, doing formative evaluation on outputs is going to be important as well, especially as you're thinking about how do we know we're hitting numbers. If you're, for example, I think, just let me try to put this into context for William Jewell College, knowing that we are hitting one of our concerns is enrollment, and being able to measure enrollment as we move through the cycle of the plan. So we are on a 5-year strategic plan. We have an enrollment goal by 2023, but we're constantly monitoring our progress towards that. And that's an output. That's not an outcome. The number of students attending William Jewell College is an output versus the outcomes, which is, okay, so what, they've come, but did they learn anything? Did they grow as a result of being at William Jewell? And those are things we, of course, can measure through their time as students. But ultimately, we're really interested in when they graduate, what kinds of jobs did they receive? How did their lives change as a result of the experience that they had? And so being able to monitor those outcomes certainly throughout a program and project delivery is going to be really important. So this is just a very simple dashboard. I mean, the one that I'm using at Jewell, or the ones that I build for strategic planning purposes for nonprofits, are probably more complex because they actually have KPIs and measures that you would be keeping track of. But just very simply, if you've never worked with a dashboard, staff retention is the goal here that we're looking at, which kind of goes back to how you might look at human capital. How do you know that you're retaining really good people at your nonprofit? And this was a slide, for some reason these slides are moving automatically. I'm not sure why, but how will you be tracking the data? How does this information align with everything else in your nonprofit? But so if one of your goals in your strategic plan is staff retention, then you're 90%. If you're at 90% of your goal, then you would code that as green. If you're 80%, you're at yellow, 70% or below, you would be in the red category. So you're very carefully defining for staff retention what green, yellow, and red looks like. So if you were at 83% of staff retention during this first quarter period for this, and this kind of answers Julie's question about like measuring outputs as you're going. So like every quarter, you can see, oh, we're at 83%. So what do we need to do to bring that into the green section? Well, we need to maybe look at some of the other measures in terms of staff satisfaction. Compensation might be something, training might be something, pathways for promotion. Those are all things that you could be tweaking and looking at in order to maybe raise your staff retention, because that's ultimately what you are hoping to accomplish. So now we've got about 20 minutes left. I kind of ran through all this. Cindy, thanks for stopping and interrupting me only a couple of times, but I'm happy to entertain questions. I'd also love it if anybody on the, like Julie and Eileen, and I haven't been able to see, I know Shara Bryce was going to be on. If anybody has any comments or reflections or want to share, disagree with me or object to anything I said, this is your time to shine.
Julie made another comment. Julie, do you want to just tell Tom what you said, or I can relay it for you?
I mean, I just, the point I made, and it was more about adding on to what Tom was saying, not necessarily disagreeing with what Tom's saying. It's a great presentation. But to talk about the fact that outputs and outcomes, we sometimes talk about them as black and white, and they're really not. A lot of times they're shades of gray. And, he was giving the example of attendance as being an output. Well, kind of it's an output, but if you think about choosing or enrollment as being a behavioral thing, it's a choice that students make over the course of a whole lot of actions and interactions with a university, personnel, faculty, all these different things that get them to that choice. That enrollment can actually be an outcome in the end. So I think that, and this is where theory of change is very fascinating to me, because it's almost, if you find yourself having either rolling outcomes or outcomes that build upon each other, that you really might want to take a look at something beyond just a simple logic model and at a full theory of change. The other thing, and I don't know, Tom, can you go back to your theory of change slide? One of the things that I teach about with theory of change specifically is an aspect that to me was missing on yours in the particular model that you chose. Because there are lots of things, like he's quoted some of these. Go back, I think it's one or two more. One more. Nope, I guess not. Forgot about that one. So he's got inputs, processes.
Oh, yeah.
It's okay. It's scanning for you. He's got inputs, processes, and results. But so often the processes piece, and really what makes this the theory, is you're going to have to be able to say, really, what is the evidence behind those processes, the inputs and the processes achieve those results or outcomes. And that's what makes it a theory. And I do a lot of federal grant writing, and one of the components we're starting to see with, hey, there's a theory of change, and then there's a logic model, is the logic model really does have the inputs, the activities, the outcomes, but the theory of change, it's that how inputs and processes research says get you to that results or outcomes. And so a lot of times maybe there's a piece here that says input, process, and then research, and then results. And there's different places you can put it depending upon, which model you choose to use. But that's a component that I think people need to understand about the theory of change.
Thank you. Well said. And yeah, I tried to simplify this. I had 30 minutes to cram in a lot of information, but thank you for expanding on that and talking about how it is more nuanced and more to it than maybe what I was able to do here.
Tom, I'm assuming I've kind of answered yes on your behalf to this, but someone requested your dashboard template, if you would share that. And
Of course, yeah.
I assume
yeah.
you will. So let people, everyone, we will post that probably where Mark posts everything. So that will be coming.
Yeah, Mark has the slides, so I'm assuming they'll all be available or already are available. So, yes.
Okay. Comment on from Shara Bryce, who was mentioned a minute ago, that it's great to have practitioners and professors in the same place here. So we agree.
That's, yeah.
Let's see. Also, everybody just check out, there's a good public example of outcomes and evidence frameworks for theories of change. So Joan Kelly's put up another resource for people in here. I'm not sure what it is. The resource is oef.rescue.org.
Okay. So other comments or have the chat open. I just opened the chat. So
yeah. There's one at the bottom there, Tom. Do you have any advice for jumping into the evaluation process midstream instead of beginning? Good question.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that's a great question. And obviously one that, you know, I don't, you know, being kind of vulnerable about, oh, we didn't really think this through. We already have funding or we're in the midst of this. I guess it's never, ever too late to stop and really just kind of begin to put a framework together and really examine. I think starting with why. I mean, why do we exist? What are we doing? What we're doing? And then lining everything up. How does it fit? How does it support? How does it help get you where you're wanting to be? And then that gets into the, you know, the inputs, the, you know, the processes, the outputs and the outcomes, being able to map that, and then to really look at, you know, ultimately, how are you measuring the work that you're doing, and what kinds of data are you tracking? What are the results that you're hoping to achieve, and how do you know you're getting there? And so that would be a place to start. And I think ultimately aligning the mission and the purpose of your organization with the work that's happening on the ground, and how do those things link together, I think would be where you could start. And then just creating a simple evaluation process. And, you know, again, the work, and there's a lot of very detailed research that you could do in terms of just simple surveys, pre-surveys, post-surveys, focus groups, interviews. You know, how do you know that people that you're working with, or the work that you're doing, has it made any difference at all? So Cindy, I'm hoping I've been talking and not looking at all the great chat. So
who do you recommend facilitating the program evaluation? In what circumstances is it beneficial to have a third party? So like I said, internal versus external question. Yeah.
Well, and Julie or others on the call, I'd welcome your thoughts about that as well. I don't know that, you know, in terms of support for, I would definitely recommend getting, you know, third-party support for actual grant writing and submission and that kind of thing. And there's a lot of this thinking that has to go into the process of grant writing. I mean, I would say that, you know, it's really going to depend. I mean, I think this could come in your strategic planning process, where I think having a third-party person facilitating that is important. But I also think this is just part of what a really good executive director or CEO is doing. And I don't know that you always have to go outside to be able to have this work done. So I don't know that there's a right or a wrong answer. I think it maybe just depends on your own comfort level with thinking through these things. And again, it's not just fundraising. This is just, you know, how do you keep your entire organization accountable and on track for meeting the goals that, again, answering the question, why do you exist, and how do you know the work that you're doing matters?
Kind of in the same frame here too, how do you decide on the tools to use? So more specifically, what type of tools do you use for the best data? I don't know if that means kind of like, you know, do you use a survey, or do you do interviews, and how do you make that decision?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things to think through here. I mean, you know, I think the tools that you use to measure your outcome would be one set of questions. The other question would be, you know, do we do a logic model versus a theory of change versus just a general approach to, just the evaluations that we choose or select and how they reinforce or support or tell us how the work we're doing is how close we are to achieving our mission. I think it will depend a lot on the sophistication, maturity of the stage of the nonprofit in the nonprofit life cycle. If you're really, if you're in a startup mode, this is going to be a lot to take on in the midst of also just trying to get, the funding going. If you're working on, as a volunteer team versus a seasoned, well-established nonprofit that has a lot of staff and people, then I think you're going to be in a very different position. I would say certainly the sophistication and maturity of a nonprofit on that cycle is really probably what's going to answer that. I mean, I would of course recommend and say, the more sophisticated, the theory of change, a dashboard, those would be things that I think are really important. I think that all nonprofits should work toward that. But recognize that this takes time, this takes work to be able to have that kind of ability to have the ability to focus on this isn't always something that if you're the executive director and you're the chief fundraiser, the chief marketing officer, the chief programming person, this is a lot to do. And how do you evaluate and measure your results? Well, ultimately, probably one of the most important things that a nonprofit does, recognize that it takes time and it's going to take some effort and it's going to burn some of the energy that you have with everything else.
I'm not sure I know you're aware of design thinking. I don't know how much you've delved into it, but we have a question about sort of putting these two together, the design thinking and theory of change. And what they're thinking about is that theory of change models kind of do backward mapping from the change through outcomes, activities, resource, that way, and ultimately track back to users' needs. But design thinking, you start with, kind of and go forward. So you start with empathy and you move forward to get to the needs. So I'm not sure that, like I said, that you have that broad of a knowledge of design thinking. I know you've dabbled in it a little bit. So, but just
yeah, and I encourage and teach design thinking, especially in a strategic planning format. To really kind of break out of a normal maybe way of building strategic planning and to kind of do that in a new and different way. I think that the connection or the intersection of design thinking with this whole idea of program evaluation and measurement, I think there's absolutely an intersection there. And I would invite other experts on the call. If Scott's on the call, definitely, or Dave, you guys that are much more ingrained or know more about design thinking, I think could maybe even talk more specifically. But do I think it fits? Absolutely, I do. And I think they could be very complementary.
I'll just chime in for a minute, Tom. This is Dave Renz. I certainly agree that they're complementary. I actually differentiate in terms of usefulness that programs basically are going to benefit from thinking at a logic model perspective, unless it's an exceptionally large and developed program like Julie was talking about. And I find theories of change especially important for organizations to understand, to inform the organization's role in a community, in a system. And, for organizations that are only one program, that's synonymous. But for organizations that have multiple programs, your theory of change is about community impact. And you may well need to reject or throw out a program after a while, close a program after a while and put a new one in because the needs of the community are changing. And the point of the design thinking part to me is really understanding. I find it more useful to employ design thinking in the context of program design and development and refinement, because it's about what's the client need, what's the recipient of services need, what are their issues, what are they, the empathy part, let's relate to what they need out of this. Design thinking is not generally employed to say, it could be in some cases, but it's not generally employed to think about, what does the community of Kansas City, Missouri, or the Kansas City metropolitan area feel and need? Design thinking is more micro in that respect usually. It's much more tied to programs or, came out of a lot of product thinking. So, these things are layered. And I think design thinking at its best is when you're trying to figure out what is it a segment of the people, the group we exist to serve, what is it they need and want from us? What do they deserve from us? And then that gets into program design. But that, again, these things, as you've pointed out, but I think it's really critical to recognize these labels sound very black and white. I guess Julie said this too, but they're concepts, and we have to employ them to make sense of how they inform us. I have to say, in blurring, and I'll stop talking after this observation, one of the things I think is especially powerful from a board development perspective is to have a conversation with your board about what would belong on our dashboard. Tom, you talk about starting with why. Start with the conversation of why with your board, and then transition to saying, okay, so what are the elements that we ought to be looking at that'll indicate progress toward the outcomes we seek to achieve? And as you might guess from what I'm sharing, I think it's an important decision process, but it's also a board development process, because what's happening is the staff and the board are getting together to talk about what the heck are we doing and why are we here? And by the way, guys, how are you going to judge whether we're making good progress or not, or whether, hopefully not this extreme, you're going to fire us because we're not making any progress? Or, equally important, a funder is going to fire us because they don't see us achieving outcomes that they care about. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, and Dave, I think you're spot on. I think the eloquence of the design thinking process is about what your clients want, what they need, how you can best serve them, which ultimately I think it aligns in my mind exactly along the line of, building a good evaluation process to ensure you're achieving those results. You're doing what they need. And so that to me, it all fits together. It is complicated. And ultimately, I mean, I'm working with a nonprofit right now that they're, and like all of us, we're all putting a huge priority on diversifying our board, or diversifying our staff, diversifying our client base. And so, how do you really hold yourself accountable? Will that be on your dashboard? Will you say, maybe it's very outcome based, that we're going to add more staff that are, people of color, and that's a flag in the sand, and that's going to mean some very important decisions and prioritizations, and it reflects values, and it reflects a sense of, yeah, we didn't just post a message about Black Lives Matter on our website. We're now really working towards change as an organization, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable, or the board is going to hold ourselves accountable to doing business differently.
Looks like we are almost out of time, Tom, but I do have one question. Also, just everybody, there has been a little bit of more comment stuff going on. So do check out kind of some of the chat in there, just to get some of the comments that especially that Julian has added to it. So do that. But Tom, like how much of the dashboard can translate to like an annual report or impact report? And how much, I'm going to add a little bit to this question. This is from Heather Beffa. How do you think about that as you're designing it? Is that part of the process, or so that you ensure that you do get some of these out of there? And also just, I think you've talked about some, but who's the audience and how do you think about
great question, Heather and Cindy. I mean, I think that the ultimate thing that you can do with a really good dashboard is to tell a story. It's to tell a story about, to your public audience, to the people making contributions, to the community at large, to the board. I mean, to everybody. Here is a story about the sewing labs. Here's a story about the organization that you represent, and how we are out there making a difference, and how we can talk about that. And so now some of the dashboard measures, it might not be things, creating a reserve fund, for example. That may not be something that you maybe put that in your annual report for sure, and talks about how you're hitting you're setting goals and you're achieving them. But I think your public story is much more focused on, we're changing lives, and we know we're changing lives because we're sitting on top of this really robust measurement and evaluation system, theory of change, a logic model, a dashboard. And so I think ultimately being able to tell that story and know that you're telling a true story that rests in data, that rests in science is going to be extremely important. And it may not be why you go about the work of creating an evaluation model or having a dashboard, but it absolutely should be what you lead with when you're talking to donors, because that's what they care about. They're going to want to care about why you exist and why it matters. So I know that we are out of time, right, Cindy? I don't know.
We're out of time.
Yeah, so I guess thank you all for participating this morning. I had participated in these early in the pandemic and haven't been a part. I was still thinking we were doing breakout groups. Obviously, we didn't do that, but thank you for participating this morning. This is a lot to put into an hour, and obviously we can go way deeper. This was a 2-day seminar, but when they asked me to facilitate something, I thought this was good because it's definitely, I think, something that we're all being asked to do more of, and it's extremely important. But it's something that we should really think through as we go out there and do the work that we do in the nonprofit sector. So thank you all so much for participating, and we definitely appreciate it.